Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. We're going to embark on a really fascinating journey, completely dissecting two foundational historical texts. Now, just a quick disclaimer right at the top. We are going to examine these texts without any political bias whatsoever. We're purely looking under the hood, kind of acting as historical mechanics, to understand exactly how the author structured their arguments and theories. It's an exercise in pure structural analysis, understanding the mechanics of these ideas from the inside out. And trust me, it is incredibly rewarding.
Now, I say we're dissecting two texts because, well, our first source, Voltaire's Toleration, generously provided us with exactly one detail, the number 256. Yep, that's it, page 256. So we're going to practice a little toleration of the unknown, leave that number right there as a monument to brevity, and immediately pivot to our massive, incredibly detailed primary text, Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1.
All right, let's dive right in. What's absolutely amazing about Capital is how Marx sets up his investigation. He doesn't start with sweeping political statements. Instead, he sets up this microscopic detective story. He explicitly states that we can't use physical tools like microscopes or chemical reagents to understand economics. Why? Well, because economics isn't a biological specimen. It's a massive, invisible social web of human relations. Instead, he asks us to use the force of abstraction. He wants us to basically zoom all the way in with our minds to find the fundamental building block of capitalist wealth, what he cleverly calls the economic cell form. To navigate this famously dense text, we need a solid roadmap. We'll start with the economic cell, move into use value versus exchange value, uncover the secret of labor time, and finally decode the language of commodities. Let's get to it.
Part 1. The economic cell.
So, our first step is actually identifying and defining the exact specimen we are putting under our conceptual microscope. Marx begins his analysis by stating that wealth in capitalist societies presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. So naturally, our starting point is just a single commodity. By definition, a commodity is an external object, a thing that satisfies human wants, whether those wants come from your stomach or your imagination. And crucially, it is exchanged for other things. Think of a smartphone, a cup of coffee, or a winter coat. These are our specimens. They are literally the fundamental atoms making up the entire economic universe around us.
Which brings us to part 2, use value versus exchange value.
We're splitting this economic cell right down the middle. The first half of this split is what Marx calls use value. Use value is strictly about physical reality and utility. It's the tangible, practical reason you actually want the object in the first place. You know, a coat keeps you warm because of its physical fabric. Iron is useful because it's hard. This property is intimately tied to the physical body of the commodity itself. If you can't use it to satisfy a need or a desire, it simply doesn't have a use value. I mean, you can't wear an abstract concept in a snowstorm, right? You need the physical coat.
But then we have the other half, exchange value. And honestly, at first glance, the text notes this feels totally accidental. It's the quantitative proportion in which one useful thing is traded for another. Why does it feel so accidental to a casual observer? Because a quarter of wheat might trade for a pound of silk in one century, and an ounce of gold in another, and maybe a software license in a third. These proportions constantly change with time and place, making it feel like exchange value has absolutely no intrinsic connection to the physical properties of the wheat itself.
This brilliantly illustrates the core dichotomy of the text. To exchange things, Marx argues we have to perform a massive mental abstraction. We basically have to strip away all their physical, useful qualities. When you trade a coat for linen, you aren't comparing the art of tailoring to the art of weaving. You're finding a common denominator. As use values, things are qualitatively different. They have different physical shapes and uses. But as exchange values, they are merely different quantities. They are completely stripped of their physical shape, becoming purely quantitative placeholders in a market.
Moving right along to part 3, the secret of labor time.
Here is where the detective work gets really intense. If we strip away the physical coat and the physical linen to make them tradable, what invisible substance is actually left over? Well, according to Marx, once you ignore the physical shape of commodities, they have only one single common property left. Human labor was expended to make them. They are, in his somewhat poetic terms, a mere congelation of homogeneous human labor. They're essentially crystals of a shared, invisible social substance.
But hold on a second. This immediately begs a pretty big question. If value comes from labor time, doesn't that mean a lazy, unskilled worker produces more valuable goods just because they take much longer to finish the job? Marx clarifies this immediately with a truly crucial concept: socially necessary labor time. The value is not determined by the individual worker's speed, but by the time required under normal conditions, with average skill, across society. If you spend 10 hours building a chair that factories can pump out in 10 minutes, society only recognizes 10 minutes of value in your chair.
So, what exactly shifts this socially necessary time? Marx gives us a fascinating list of variables: the average amount of skill, the state of science, the social organization of production, the extent of the means of production, and even physical conditions like the weather. For instance, the text points out that when steam-powered looms were introduced in England, they essentially halved the labor required to weave yarn into cloth. The value of the cloth fell by half across the entire market, completely regardless of how long the remaining traditional hand-loom weavers took. The benchmark of society had fundamentally shifted.
To really cement this idea, let's look at this fantastic analogy directly from the text, comparing diamonds and bricks. Diamonds are obviously incredibly rare. Finding them requires a massive average expenditure of labor time across mines and continents, which is exactly why so much value is packed into such a tiny physical space. But, Marx speculates, if science advanced to the point where we could easily convert carbon into diamonds with very little labor, their value might actually fall below that of basic bricks. The labor time dictates the value, not the sparkle.
And that perfectly sets up Part 4, the language of commodities.
Now that we've got a handle on these abstract concepts, value, use value, labor time, how do they interact in the real world? How do commodities basically speak to one another? The crucial point here is understanding the elementary form of value. Take a simple equation from the text. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. The linen plays the active role. Its value is the one being expressed, so it's in the relative form. The coat, however, acts completely passively. It serves as a physical mirror, reflecting the linen's value. The linen essentially uses the physical, tangible body of the coat to express its own invisible value.
Let's actually see the mechanics of this living relationship in action. Because value is intimately tied to labor time, if the labor required to produce linen suddenly doubles, maybe the soil is completely exhausted from overuse, the value of the linen doubles. So 20 yards of linen now equals 2 coats. Conversely, if a poor wool crop makes coats twice as hard to produce, the value of the coat doubles. Suddenly, 20 yards of linen only equals half a coat. The equation isn't static at all. It's a living, breathing reflection of shifting human labor time across the globe.
This riddle of equivalence is so complex that even the ancients grappled with it. Marx brings in a puzzle from Aristotle. Aristotle looked at market exchange and said, 5 beds equals 1 house. He correctly recognized that to trade these two wildly different things, there had to be some equalizing commensurable substance between them.
But here's the crazy part. Aristotle eventually just gave up on the riddle. He basically called it a makeshift for practical purposes. Why couldn't a literal genius like Aristotle solve this? Well, Marx makes a brilliant historical observation here. Aristotle's society was founded upon slavery. Because his entire world was built from the ground up on the fundamental inequality of men, his brain was literally blocked from discovering the concept of equal human labor as the common, invisible substance shared by the beds in the house. It was a social blind spot, not an intellectual one.
Once you do realize that equal human labor is the secret ingredient, however, the whole system just explodes. We start with our single economic cell, the elementary form, where linen equals a coat. But that inevitably multiplies into the expanded form. The linen's value can express itself in an endless, sprawling chain of other commodities, a coat, or tea, or coffee, or iron, or gold. The single cell divides and grows into an entire, infinitely complex market ecosystem. Which brings us to our final, provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. If a coat acts as a mirror for the linen, and suddenly every single commodity in this sprawling market is trying to mirror its value against one single widely accepted item, what does that elementary form eventually turn into? I'll leave you to ponder how this microscopic equation between a coat and some linen inevitably evolves into the concept of money itself. I really hope this structure invites you to look at everyday items, whether it's a winter coat, a simple brick, or a diamond, in a completely new microscopic way. Thank you so much for learning with me today.